somewhere that they can afford to just parade around in like it's nothing. That means the real motherlode has to be hidden somewhere else. You also need to remember that the conquistadors were not just a random assortment of fun-loving Spaniards from all walks of life. The people who chose to become conquistadors were people who wanted to conquer, enslave, and steal gold and silver from this brave new world so they could return to Spain grotesquely rich. This is, one could say, a selection pressure that's likely to produce a population of conquistadors that are overall much more inclined to kick down door number 2 than to ponder the anthropological possibilities of door number 1. They found El Hombre Dorado, the Golden Man. They found a lake full of sacrificed gold, and guess what? It wasn't enough. It was time to shorten the name and start looking for El Dorado, the City of Gold. Or literally just the gold, which is honestly more on the nose. Before we move on to that hot mess, I want to put a bit of a spotlight on what happened in Guadavita because it's kind of hilarious. So this coronation ceremonies unsurprisingly left the lake pretty full of shiny golden artifacts, and the conquistadors wanted it. But lake dredging technology wasn't exactly peaking in 1540, so the process wasn't easy. In 1545, 2 conquistadors attempted to manually lower the water level with a bucket chain that took 3 months and only lowered the water level by 10 feet. But they did pull out $100,000 worth of gold by today's standards, so that's nothing to sneeze at.
Right, I couldn't have been mad at that. 3 months, 100 bands,
I mean, we got some buckets. We can do that.
I couldn't be mad at that.
Water level by 65 feet and retrieving $300,000 worth of gold before the notch collapsed and killed all his workers. Somehow he managed to die broke. Things then stagnated for a bit until 1898 when a British-controlled company, creatively titled the Company for the Exploitation of the Lagoon of Guadavita, set up a huge pump that drained the entire lake down to 4 feet of muck and slime, which hardened into concrete under the sun, rendering almost all the gold totally irretrievable. They dredged up a small amount of gold, under $8,000 by today's standards, and went bankrupt shortly thereafter.
Y'all suck. What the fuck is wrong? How did y'all go bankrupt?
Anyway,
it's a lick of gold. It's a lick of gold. Like, y'all motherfuckers are swimming in gold and y'all niggas is going broke.
The conquistadors started looking around for the real gold motherlode, El Dorado. And in the process, things got pretty crazy. In 1539, for example, the conquistadors got word of something called the 7 Cities of Gold, 7 wealthy pueblos located in what is now the Arizona desert. Chasing these rumors, the conquistadors found a handful of nice small towns, but no gold, silver, or turquoise among them. So they just conquered the place, enslaved all the locals, and set themselves up as the local government. Like,
I wonder if turquoise is really that valuable. That's crazy.
Pizarro, the younger half-brother to Francisco Pizarro, who toppled the Incan Empire, here's a story from the locals about a valley to the east full of gold and cinnamon. Gonzalo organizes a huge expedition of 340 conquistadors and 4,000 locals, and they don't find a valley, and a whole bunch of them die. When the expedition is forced to turn back, Gonzalo sends his buddy Francisco de Orellana to keep looking for this valley, and while he doesn't find El Dorado, he does find the Amazon River, which names the Amazon after getting his ass kicked by a gang of warrior women. Very appropriate. In 1560, a group of about 300 conquistadors are led by Pedro de Ursua in an alleged search for El Dorado, but this is actually a front for his real motive, which is to get rid of them. They're all veterans of the Incan conquest with nothing to do but stir up trouble, so he's just trying to keep them from breaking anything important by getting them as far away as possible. Unfortunately, he's killed by his second-in-command, Conquistador Lope de Aguirre, and the gang then marauders their way to the coast, ravaging native villages wherever they go. I'm telling you, I'm shocked that the conquistadors would be so backstabbing and recklessly destructive to the native population. They just seem so nice up till now. Things take a bit of a turn in 1595 when an Englishman gets in on the action.
One the conquistadors,
who's hell-bent on finding El Dorado because... hold on, I think I've got this written down. Okay, because he heard of an account allegedly from a guy named Juan Martinez, who has no record of existing, but was most likely based on a real guy named Juan Martín de Abujar. And Juan Martinez has supposedly been part of an expedition to find El Dorado being led by Conquistador Diego de Ordaz, but Diego de Ordaz's expedition happened in like 1529, and he also died in 1532, and Juan Martinez supposedly had to happen to him in 1570, so the writer probably got Diego de Ordaz confused with a different conquistador, Pedro Marver de Silva, who did search for El Dorado around 1568, and did have Juan Martín de Abujar on his crew, but whatever. So this Juan Martinez, who participated in the search for El Dorado,
that's exactly why you can't fucking trust history, man.
This is why we can't find the gold now.
That's why you can't trust history all that much, man, because it's only the perspective of whoever made it. Like.
I've never had anything more legit in my entire life. Let's go. It's so I've never had anything so legit in my life. He's really really serious about it and is also a complete mess. He straight up kidnaps a conquistador, Antonio de Berrio, to guide him around before ditching him. But it doesn't stop there. Oh no. Sir Raleigh has a lot of ideas about El Dorado. For instance, he's decided it's actually a city called Manoa, and it's on the banks of a Lake Parime, because that actual gold-filled empire with a secret gold-filled lake wasn't good enough for him. He decided he wanted to start making up names. And he also wants to claim El Dorado for England and use it as a foothold for a colony to muscle the Spaniards out of South America and get all that sweet, sweet New World money for himself. Pretty intricate plan. Only one small problem. El Dorado wasn't cooperating. Raleigh couldn't find it, and while later explorers and cartographers would haphazardly throw Manoa and Lake Parime onto their maps of South America under the assumption that they were probably in there somewhere, there was never any evidence that either place existed. I will say this for them, though. If it wasn't for all those hunts for El Dorado, our maps of South America would probably be a lot less comprehensive. Nothing gets the cartographers out in force quite like the secret laws. Anyway, in 1616, Sir Walter Raleigh, now old and grody, returns to the New World to renew the hunt for El Dorado and immediately ransacks a Spanish outpost, getting his son and his lieutenant killed, and incidentally also violating a 1604 treaty with Spain, which leads to King James executing him to avoid an international incident. Good show, I'm voting for you. People continue regularly
all the wrong
perilous
decisions.
expeditions looking for El Dorado or Lake Parime and keep turning up empty. And in a few noteworthy cases, a local comes running telling the governing conquistadors they've super found silver or gold in the rocks in some dangerous faraway location, and the expedition always goes herring off at top speed, and they always turn up empty and also usually die, and amazingly they still keep falling for it. I feel like the third time I got bricked into my own basement, I would stop falling for the Amontillado gambit. Also, as an extra bit of spectacularly entertaining stupidity, the
everybody know about that
regularly
shit.
turned up large amounts of platinum while searching for gold, but dismissed it as junk, calling it
like
unripe silver, which is literally the platinum.
Notorious.
The locals have been looking at it for ages, since it shares a lot of
Everybody
properties
knows
with
so
gold, like
hard.
being almost
Everybody know the
totally
Raven.
relatively
The ones
easy to
that
work.
come
And they had a
next
lot of finely
are
worked
the
platinum
Master of the
ornaments that were
Red Death
literally completely unique to the
and
region.
Castle of
See,
Amontillado.
ironically, the
Oh,
conquistadors
and the
didn't
pendulum.
recognize its
Because the
value because
pendulum
platinum
is
is
just
so
fucking
rare,
crazy.
and at this
Like
point, the
just
conquistadors
at the
didn't
time,
know
the
it
heart and
existed. They
the
were
flow.
literally pulling
No,
out
that's
nuggets of the
telltale
rarest
heart.
precious
The
metal on earth and
pendulum
dumping it as
is
scrap because it
this
wasn't
guy
valuable.
wakes
And if you
up
think
and
that's
strapped to
bad,
a
Spain
table
later
that
had a
has
small
a
problem where
that
people
has
were
an
using
axe
platinum
on
to
it.
counterfeit
Oh no, that has an
since
axe
they
above
were
it,
similar
just
in
swinging
weight
and
and
it gets
softness. And
closer and
Spain
closer to
responded to
you.
this financial crisis
Yeah,
by
that's
dumping their
ridiculous.
entire national
Oh,
platinum
because
supply
then he
into the
escaped from
ocean.
the
This whole debacle is such an incredibly apt metaphor for the flaws inherent in the
he
colonial
escaped from the
system and how
pendulum,
lust for
but then
gold
realized that
literally
he's stuck in
blinded
a
them to
pit.
the true unique
Like
value
that
of
there's
the new
just
world
that
that if
there's
I
nothing
read it in a
around him
book, I
except
would call the
for
writer a hack. Oh, the
there's a hole
colonizers
in
dismissed
the
the
middle of the ground
incredibly
and no
valuable
way
and
out,
unique
and the
resource of
walls
the
get caught
colony
on
as worthless
fire,
scrap
and
because
then the
they're too
walls
busy
start
digging for
closing
their
in.
own personal currency they've arbitrarily assigned
the
value
pendulum.
to. Yeah, nice. And I bet
That's
the
what
real
the
treasure
pendulum
was the
is.
friends
It's
they
the
made
real
along the
person.
way, right?
But,
I
yeah,
swear,
whatever.
nothing owns colonial Spain harder than it owned itself. Anyway, the passion for the El Dorado search was already starting to die down only a couple centuries after it first came up. In 1743, French explorer and mathematician Charles Marie de la Condamine mapped the Amazon and many of its tributaries, and later wrote that he found no sign of any El Dorado, and that the story was most likely the result of greedy conquistadors really wanting to hear that there was a magical city of gold they hadn't plundered yet, and desperate locals really wanting to get rid of these goddamn Spaniards, sending them off on wild goose chases just to get rid of them. A very bad combination, or a very good one, depending on your perspective. By the 1800s, El Dorado was basically accepted as fiction, that if it were out there, someone would have found it by now, and that the only reason anyone ever thought it was real was simple wishful thinking with no factual basis. It would be cool if El Dorado was real. I personally think there's a serious lack of cool, unexplored things to discover in this day and age of precise satellite imaging and accurate world maps and stuff. But El Dorado is more of a cautionary tale than anything else. It's theoretically enduring enough to make you wish it were real. It's just plausible enough to make you seriously entertain the possibility that it could be real. And most importantly, it's such a high bar that no matter what incredibly cool stuff you happen to find while searching for it, it'll never feel like what you're looking for. The conquistadors found a vastly wealthy empire that dumped gold into its own lake every few decades, and it wasn't El Dorado-y enough for them. It was never going to be enough. As the search dragged on and it became more and more obvious that the only El Dorado they'd ever hoped to find would be completely overgrown ruins or just a random lake, the appeal withered away. If it's not enough gold, it's not El Dorado, and they had to keep looking. And that's the fun thing about greed. It was never going to be enough gold. El Dorado is that rare myth constructed from nothing but wishful thinking. No deeper origin, no kernel of truth, just a lot of very greedy people eating themselves alive, trying to find the one thing that would finally satisfy that hunger. Maybe they should have tried friendship. I've heard it's the greatest treasure of all. The best things in life are free. Well, you can keep them all, birds and bees. Now give me money. That's what I want. That's what I want. That's what I want. That's
Keep practicing, boo. You're getting there.
That's what I want.
Oh shit.
Man, that nigga Loki. Just gonna kill his little brother.
We're here for you.
And then tell everybody.
Visit your doctor. Fast and free right to your door without the hassle at a price you love. Order now at one.
Said Loki killed his little brother.
Yeah, that guy who he killed and then told everybody that he killed him, technically it was his little brother because of real Norse mythology, they're not half brothers, they're whole brothers. And the guy he killed was his little brother.
Our story begins with Thor and Loki traveling to visit the confusingly named Jotun king Utgard Loki in relation to regular Loki for unspecified reasons, but not before a quick side trip where they grabbed dinner with a local peasant family. Unsurprisingly, the family's not super well equipped to feed Thor. Luckily, Thor always keeps an emergency snack on his person for just such an occasion, by which I mean he slaughters one of his cherry-coated goats for the peasants, but tells them to save the bones and wrap them in skin overnight since it'll let him bring the goat back to life in the morning, which kind of implies he does this a lot. They share a
Right.
Something about him eating the. God damn! What the fuck? I know I didn't know that anyway. I could have sworn the motherfucker was these niggas was just down here though. That's crazy.
The other dude was down though, right over the wall, but
I don't know.
he gone.
That's
There's only
crazy.
one other person left.
That is crazy. I just landed right next to
He
him
must
though.
have been down when
One of them was down and the other dude was helping him up. But also, I mean, they must be. But damn, still, even then.
Oh, so it's only one person left? Oh,
Shit. Okay. Well, it's going down. It's going down. His fuel is empty now. Oh, he's being assaulted. Oh shit.
Dude, bro, you're being assaulted.
I'm okay.
But no, so Thor and Loki are on their way somewhere, and they got to stop overnight to camp, and they end up staying with his family. And the family's like, "Oh shit, guys, we'll make you some food. Yo, we don't have enough food for y'all." And Thor's like, "Oh, it's cool. Just kill my goat. We'll use its meat. Then save the bones. We'll wrap him up in some leather, and then tomorrow when we wake up, he'll be alive, and I can keep using him to pull apart." Think about that. No, now. Fine, you have free goat meat whenever you want. So that goat, it's that goat's life. Goat's traumatized.
Yeah. I mean, not no more, probably. He's probably been doing this for hundreds of years.
Oh, but no, that's even worse. For it to no longer be affected is even.
Yeah, after a while, you're getting up.
You know what that reminds me of? The Beast.
What's that?
And over the garden wall, because you never your calling card, because you never really see him. He's always just eyes in the forest.
Oh, my calling card. Oh,
yeah, kind of just look like eyes behind the little boy.
Yeah, that's
My little beast.
mm-hmm.
The bat probably doesn't help.
There's a whole lot of creepy shit going on here.
Sorry, yeah, but yeah, fucking goat, fucking. It's horrible.
Yeah, I mean, maybe not so much no more.
It's just like goop, blood-producing goop. It feels like the ickiest part of the animal too. Okay, never mind. Point is, the bone is broken, so the next day when Thor resurrects the goat, it's acquired a sudden limp. Thor is pretty cranky, but as payment for the goat, the peasant offers him his children, Thjalfi and Röskva, as his servants, and Thor seems to consider this a
kind of person are you?
It's acquired a sudden limp. Thor is pretty cranky, but as payment for the goat. But the peasant's son, Thjalfi, cracks open one of the goat bones for that tasty marrow. You know, I never saw the appeal. It's just like goop, blood-producing goop. It feels like the ickiest part of the animal too. Okay, never mind. Point is, the bone is broken, so the next day when Thor resurrects the goat, it's acquired a sudden limp. Thor is pretty cranky, but as payment for the goat, the peasant offers him his children, Thjalfi and Röskva.
Well, he the one that broke the bone. What do I gotta face God's wrath because you broke the goat's bone? You knew that was Thor's goat. How old is this kid? Okay, I'm sorry.
He might have to get his first ass whooping today.
Oh, you might have to go be a goaltender, my nigga, because lightning hurts. Lightning, I can't fight lightning.
Lightning will say you die.
He just resurrected the goat. If you go resurrect me, I doubt it.
Yeah,
I doubt it. I'm
probably.
pretty sure he cares more about that goat than any of us.
Look.
Worst case scenario, you end up in Valhalla, or no, because that's not where the Vikings live. They don't live in the wherever the Vikings land.
But to make things
Well,
worse,
that's,
it was like a continental subduction. Tries hitting
Bill,
him
no,
with
that's
justice.
Maybe it is Valhalla.
Very sleepless
I think that's
later,
Wonder
Screamer tells the
Woman.
gang they should
Right,
quickly turn back
that's
and abandon their journey.
yes, but I don't know. Because dead people, like, people don't go to where the gods actually are. I know the gods come down and sit with them after the bloody battle every day.
But that Screamer leaves, and the gang continues to guard Loki because Odin didn't raise no quitter, but he definitely raised a fool. So the gang arrives.
No, he didn't raise no quitter, but he raised a fool.
To accommodate the really big giants. Continuing the humiliation down the line, Thor finds the massive cages too heavy for a boat, but on the plus side, they're comparatively small enough to fit through the bars, so they get in and approach the truly enormous Utgard Loki. Utgard Loki is unimpressed, as Screamer suggested he would be, and tells the gang that he doesn't let just anyone stay in his fortress. All his visitors need to be very exceptional in at least one way, so if they want to stay, they're going to ruin themselves. So Loki steps up all like, he won't accept you. No one can be faster. And Utgard Loki's like, unorthodox display of hubris, but very well, and brings out the also Loki's named Loki, not to be confused with either of the Lokis in this story, and sets up a big trough for meat for the two of them to go at. Loki and Loki demolish the trough with terrifying efficiency and meat in the middle, but where Loki effectively ate all the meat off the bones on his side, Loki ate the meat, the bones, and the trough. Loki won, Loki 0. So next up, Loki says he's the fastest runner he knows, and Utgard Loki's like, challenge accepted. He calls up this guy Hugi. Hugi and the Alpha race, but Hugi keeps beating him by ridiculously wide margins. So Utgard Loki does admit the Alpha's the best runner they've had in a while. Hugi won, Alpha 0. Crossfly, I guess, doesn't want to participate in his honor scout measuring contest, so next up is Thor, who says he'd like to participate in a contest featuring Grand, I like it. So Utgard
Damn, I'm about to get up on my shit. These niggas ain't playing no games today.
One drink, the rest take 2, and nobody's pathetic enough to leave 3. So Thor takes the biggest swig he can manage and barely makes it out. 2 hearty swigs later, the level's visibly low, but he's nowhere near finished. Thor 0, drinking 1. And Utgard Loki asks if he wants to try something else instead. So Utgard Loki's like, well, I never would have suggested this to the mighty Thor if he hadn't just proved himself to be a colossal wuss, but how would you like to try picking up my cat? So Thor tries to pick up the cute kitty, but it does that cat thing where it goes all liquid. It just stretches and stretches, so by the time Thor's got it all the way over his head, only one of its claws is on the ground. Thor 0, cat 1. So by now, Thor has had to really try it. He's hungry, he's cranky, he's embarrassed, and he really wants to fight something.
So he really wants to fight something.
And the bad day gets worse when Utgard Loki brings out a diminutive old lady as his sparring partner and takes a dive into terrible territory when she
I've
kicks
heard
his
this
ass.
story
4-0,
before.
Grandma won. So Utgard Loki stops the match.
I've heard this story before.
Even though they lost every
Damn,
challenge,
that nigga got
their
beat up
sheer
by a
protagonist
granny.
gumption impressed him. Maybe it's just regular kidding. They eat, drink, party, and sleep, and the next day, Utgard Loki escorts them outside the fortress to see them off, and privately says, look guys, I'm gonna level with you. You're never coming back here, because I seriously underestimated you, and you nearly ruined everything. So basically, Utgard Loki is a huge prankster and powerful illusionist who just kind of wanted to screw with them by giving them impossible tasks they were guaranteed to fail at, which is a pretty classic fairy tale format. But Thor is so freaking powerful that he kept nearly killing him or destroying very important parts of the planet in his efforts to succeed. The trouble started when Screamer found him in the woods. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Screamer was Utgard Loki in disguise, and he cast some illusions on Thor, so when he tried to hit him in the head, he was hitting nearby mountains instead, incidentally leaving huge squared-off valleys wherever he swung. Already pretty unsettling for the trickster. The ravenous Loki that managed to outeat Loki was actually a raging wildfire, and the speedster that beat the Alpha in a foot race was the personification of thought, both obviously unbeatable in their respective fields. The drinking horn Thor failed to empty was actually connected to the ocean, which is clearly undrinkable, but through his valiant efforts to get drunk, he managed to lower the world's water level several feet.
Because it actually went down.
I might be in over my head. That cat he couldn't pick up was his legendary enemy, Jormungandr the Midgard Serpent, and the fact that he managed to dislodge even one paw was very, very dangerous for the integrity of the world overall. And the old woman who beat his ass was old age, and the fact he managed to fight her even a little was pants-sproutingly freaky for old Utgard Loki. So with that cat out of the bag, Utgard Loki tells him
Yeah, I've heard.
just way too OP, and if they try, he'll protect his castle with more illusions and make it totally find him. Thor reacts by pulling out Mjolnir to beat some catharsis out of him, and to find out guard Loki and the castle both vanish. And that's the story of how Thor had a very embarrassing long weekend full of failure and disappointment, but somehow came out of it cooler and more validated in the eyes of both himself and the world. Cause he had a bad day, take it one down.
That's what I'm talking about. That's a good story. Because everybody, the only thing that could outbeat Loki was a wildfire. And the little boy they had, essentially kidnapped. The only thing that outbeat him was thought itself. That's fucking. And then the cup that he gave Thor was attached to the ocean, and he still lowered it several feet. He's like, yeah, you guys are never coming back here. Y'all almost ruined everything. Fuck you guys. And they don't fight old age.
That was a move for sure.
That's great. That's great. I wonder who that kid turned out to be, because I mean, I understand the other two, but that was just some guy that y'all kidnapped for breaking your girl's car, right? Why was he so fast? Just wondering. Was he actually secretly Tarkai? That's why he broke the bone, so he didn't know it. I don't know.
So much of it being famously codified. No,
That's
so
completely
today we're
history.
talking about
Louis and Maria
Valentine's
Antoinette.
Day is upon us, and that means exactly two things. First,
Uh,
today is the
Louis and
perfect day to talk
Maria
about some of
Antoinette,
history's most famous couples, and
the
second,
ones that
the
got their
grocery
heads
stores
cut off.
tomorrow and
That wasn't the good part of it. The good part of it was like how many monarchs you hear about actually never having a relationship and everything.
which sees our hero
They
Achilles
were actually genuinely happy together.
one true love.
You know?
Before you ask,
And
no, I
in
am
the
not talking
end,
about his
she
boyfriend.
well,
I'm talking
she's
about
a
his
dick,
boyfriend.
but she's not.
Because
Because I feel she was like in the end, she kind of wished that she would have had a girlfriend or something. Because she was like, I would have had some reason to be mad about anything.
And sent across the
No, we had a great life.
Achilles and Patroclus grew up together, trains together with the centaur Chiron, and when news of the Trojan War came
And
to
it's
town,
not her-
they moved right the heck on out of there to the island of Skyros. There, Achilles disguised himself as one of the king's daughters, and
I don't want to tell a story. I'm gonna tell a story on here one day. It's a story about this chick. She decided that she wanted some money. So to get some money, she decided she would have this prostitute that looked a little bit like Marie Antoinette go talk to this dude that Marie Antoinette had publicly banished from the castle, right? Like, but this dude, like, because he had gotten in trouble with her, he would do more to get back in her favor or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, backing up, there's a necklace. The necklace was made for a mistress, but the king who got it made died, so the necklace got given away.
Yo. Yup. All right, for sure. Hey, shit, 30. Got you. For sure. Okay.
Oh, that was sneaky.
Usually
Okay, so the king had a necklace made for his mistress. This is not Marie Antoinette's husband, a different king, probably from another country. But so a king had a necklace made for his mistress, right?
Okay.
Most expensive thing pretty much ever made, for a person to wear. But he ended up dying before he could give it to her, right? And he didn't pay for it. So these people just have this ridiculously expensive diamond that nobody can fucking afford, or necklace made out of diamonds, sapphires, shit, and nobody can afford this, So they go to Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette, you're the most beautiful fucking French queen ever, and you know what would make beauty even more beautiful? This shit.
Mm-hmm.
And she's like, oh, first off, I ain't gonna wear nothing that was made for another bitch, especially a nigga side bitch, okay? Like, that's what she said real talk. Like, okay. Second off, we ain't got the money for that. No. Right? So, go back to the other bitch. The other bitch, she, like, I need to come up with. So she know about this prostitute that looked like Marie Antoinette, right? Enough like Marie Antoinette to trick somebody in the dark, you know? So she gets the prostitute to go to the dude who Marie Antoinette has kicked, like he did something to piss her off. So she's like, you ain't allowed in the castle no more, fuck you, right? So she find that nigga, and she like, Marie Antoinette needs something from you. You gotta meet her here in the garden at night. Right? Prostitute meet her. She like, look, I really wanted to buy this necklace and I couldn't buy it like outright because, you know, the war and all the shit that's going on. If I just bought this necklace, everybody be mad at me, you know? And oh God. Long story short, she get both of the other bitches get caught because the king ended up finding out about all of this shit, and he called the dude into the shit because he's like, she said to the dude, I'm gonna pay you back for this shit, just go and buy it for me real quick, right? And then he like, yeah, I got you.
You handle the bags or something down the floor.
So he write out some papers like, I got the queen want this shit, y'all give me this shit, and the queen will pay for it. I know. Like the queen will pay for it in a few months, right? The months go by, she never sent no money, he never sent no money. So the people who made the jewelry go to the king like, yo, the queen owes some money. And then he like, Marie like, I don't owe nobody shit. And then they like, no, you had no dude come and get the shit. So they called the dude. And the dude like, no, we was writing letters back and forth, bitch. Remember you said all that shit? And Maria's like, oh, nigga, fuck you, know, because she got mad. She's like, you snitching, fuck you, you know? And then King is like, chill, let me see the letter. And he handed the letter. He like, get the fuck out of here. He's like, what you mean? He's like, that's not my wife's handwriting. He's like, I don't know who the fuck you was talking to, but it wasn't her.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the story about how love conquers all. He wasn't even worried about it. She got mad. She's like, oh no, this nigga lying on my name. Baby, no. And he's like, baby, I got this. Calm down. I got this. Give me the letter. Fuck out of here.
Yeah, at least he knew her enough to know the difference.
Right. I think both of the bitches ended up dying, but the dude, he didn't because his family was worth too much money. And technically, he got tricked. But He was in more trouble for thinking that the prostitute was Maria Antoinette. Already captured. Yeah, he was in more trouble for thinking that the prostitute could be Maria Antoinette than.
I don't know this bitch personally.
No, he did.
Oh, yeah. Oh, he's stupid, yeah.
Like, you knew her personally enough to get kicked out of her house.
Anybody can get kicked out of royalty's house.
Personally, for her to kick you out of her house. Because, I mean, I could get kicked out of her house, but she probably ain't gonna do it, you know?
I guess whatever.
Right? I will be escorted. But that's one of my favorite stories. That's one of my favorite stories. But that story went into the newspapers, and by that time, Marie Antoinette had such a bad reputation that people were like, no, she probably really just set these people up, and she tried to buy the diamond under false pretenses and fuck her. Even though when they first tried to get rid of the diamond, they brought it to her, and she said no. People were still like, no, she's a fucking liar, fuck her. Y'all some haters.
That's real.
She never said let them eat cake. None of that. Like, Marie Antoinette is one of my favorite misunderstood figures. People have a very bad perception of her, and
yeah, it's because she's a bad person.
No, because she was young and pretty, and it ain't my fault I look better than you. She was young and pretty, and she had a beautiful family and a happy marriage and happy kids. And what the fuck are you to be happy, bitch? Well, I'm the queen, so I mean, I'm just saying. I mean, but at the same time, that's not even allowed to do. You know, when everything went to hell, she was still like, you know, what's the chances that I actually had a happy life? You know, and my husband never had an affair, and everything was really good. Everything was really fucking great until it all just wasn't. And then on top of it, she was fucking German. And I love Marie Antoinette. Her whole fucking story is fucking beautiful. They took her puppies.
Fucking kidding. And these
Took her
niggas
puppies
is
from her.
rough.
They took her puppies from her and gave her French puppies. Because her puppies were German, and they were like, no, you're a French princess now. Took her puppies, took her clothes, took her friends, and she walked into a new country naked and alone.
It's a better way to get into a new country. Naked and alone. Coming to a new country, that's the best way you can do it.
Probably not the best way. Probably with some clothes with a few $100s. Like, that's not the best way to do it.
You'll be very well known for that.
I mean, oh, man. I mean, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the whole story is just sad. The whole story is sad. But at the same time, I'm going
Oh, that is the not going on.
Why we were trying to get to.
Yeah, but
so they killed other people around you. Damn. Just watching the exes disappear. Juggernaut?
No, not gonna get any more missiles. That's crazy. That was a special ops mission I was for, so who knows?
It says cannon rounds infinite. Oh, it would have said Hydra rockets. You had 8, but it said 0 out of 8. Maybe you did.
I should have all of them. That's why they disappeared so far.
Yeah, we should go for rockets at first. Yeah, they kept the people from around you.
Mm-hmm.
Oh no.
Oh no. I'm scared.
Shooting at me. Stand by. Stand back.
When news of the Trojan War came to town, they both know right that had gone out there to the island of Skyros. There, Achilles disguised himself as one of the king's daughters and almost dodged the draft until buzzkill Odysseus came to cash in that pesky little Pan-Hellenic blood oath. And so our story takes us to the beaches of Troy. 9 straight years, and then suddenly everything happens all at once. You all know the drill. Achilles gets mad at the most infuriating character in ancient history. He and Patroclus go to sulk, and also bang maybe. Then Patroclus gets dressed up in Achilles' armor to go fight the Trojans. This works astoundingly well until Apollo nerfs his spatial awareness, and the ensuing hailstorm of javelins does him in shortly after. This, of course, sets the plot into Act 3, where Achilles goes justifiably berserk over the death of his person and murders his way across the Trojan army until he gets murdered back. War, alright? Per Achilles' own request, his ashes were mixed with Patroclus in the same funeral urn so that they could be with each other for eternity. Now, to anybody with basic reading comprehension, this is an extremely touching story of a lifelong love. A story so central to the plot of the Iliad that the epic literally doesn't make sense if Achilles and Patroclus don't love each other more than life itself. But scholars and historians haven't always seen it that way. Now, I partly wanted to talk Patroclus because it's emblematic of how LGBT history can be ignored and even totally rewritten. Heck, in 2003's Troy, Achilles and Patroclus are recast as cousins, because the only way the filmmakers could justify their all-consuming love in a totally not gay manner was to make them blood relatives. And this isn't limited to Hollywood, because if a classicist can look you in the eye and tell you that Sappho's poems are just gals being pals, then you know that the open acknowledgement of LGBT history is gonna be a little sparse. Even in ancient Greece, the single gayest locale in history. In conclusion, if you want a good dose of the ancient OTP, go read the Song of Achilles. Thank me later. Now let's skip ahead a millennium here to the tale of our favorite disaster couple, Cleopatra and Mark Antony. Born into the disaster dynasty that was the Ptolemaic family, Queen Cleopatra of Egypt had previously been the squeeze of choice for famed womanizer and knife-wound
Squeeze of
aficionado
choice.
Knife-wound
But this story, we're
aficionado.
skipping ahead to the part where
That's
Caesar's
rude.
adopted heir, Caesar's favorite general, and some loser third guy
Good
teaming
idea.
up to run the Republic.
Fit with knife
Octavian
holes.
took
No,
the
you know how
west
Jason-
and Marcus
Jason
Antonius
the
took
puppy.
Greece in the east. Strategically speaking, Cleopatra needed Rome's
Caesar the
support
knife-wound
to defend
aficionado.
Egypt, and Antony needed
That's
Egyptian
not how
money
you-
and manpower
that's not how you want to be
to fund the
remembered.
campaign against the Parthians.
It's not by your worst moments.
So Eastern Rome and Cleopatra's
I know
Egypt
it's
were
gonna
That's how we
poke
remember
it
him.
just so
It's
happened
so
that Antony and Cleopatra got along pretty well, too. And
Stab,
early
stab,
sisters
stab.
Stab by one of your best
Cleopatra
friends.
and Antony
No, he wasn't
both
the one
had
that
3
did.
children together and
Pretty
slowly
cool.
went about
No, it's probably one of
consolidating
his rivals,
into a
actually,
shiny
look at
new
history.
Romano-Egyptian.
And not our
They
Shakespeare
established a
plays that
formal
were
imperial
written like
succession between their
2,000
children.
years
Antony
later.
gave Cleopatra a few Roman provinces. Cleopatra gave Antony an army
It's a
that
good story.
evaporated on
It
first
makes for a
contact
good
with the
story.
Parthians.
If he gets stabbed by his best friend,
military power
his
soon
best friend
became
was probably
rapidly
Mark Antony. He
outgunned
was
by
also
Octavian in
banging
the
as well.
west, and the swiftly Philip of the lands was starting to buckle under its own weight. Uh-oh. Undaunted by the impending perils of war with Western Rome, Antony and Cleopatra hosted an elaborate festival where they awarded their children with Roman provinces, Egyptian territories, and entire kingdoms yet unconquered, basically gifting the entire Eastern Mediterranean to one middle schooler and 3 toddlers. I shudder to imagine what the baby shower's gift registry must have looked like. Yes, so I see here that you're
Mountains and
interested in buying
forests.
the island of Cyprus for the royal baby, but unfortunately, Senator Lucius has already purchased it. Could I perhaps interest you in a subtler and more intimate gift? Like the Parthenon. Okay. Things really went south for them at the Battle of Actium against Octavian, where Cleopatra bailed from the fight entirely and Antony followed swiftly after. Now, abandoning your entire navy is a less than optimal battle strategy, so from there it was pretty much game over.
Right.
Sources from Plutarch to Shakespeare proceed to squeeze every last ounce of drama out of the defeated couple with elaborate suicides and picturesque scenes of dying in each other's arms, but the reality was probably a little less theatrical. Whether you subscribe to the snakebite or not, there's no denying that the tale of Antony and Cleopatra just bleeds tragedy. Two monarchs starting on top of the world only to be crushed by the weight of their own hubris. So for all of their genuine love, they are nonetheless history's prime disaster couple. Hopping forward one metric Roman Empire, we arrive at the Byzantine royals, Justinian and Theodora. Ruling together from the 520s to the late 540s, Justinian and Theodora were the definitive imperial power couple of the ancient world, and they oversaw everything from the sweeping reconquest of the Western Mediterranean, comprehensive legal reforms, and an extensive building program. But professional accomplishments aside, it's their private lives that raise the most eyebrows. Justinian's uncle and adoptive father Justin started as a humble farmer before becoming emperor, and Theodora was the daughter of a bear trainer at Constantinople's chariot stadium. I'll be entirely honest, until right now I don't know that they had bears involved in the chariot races. But now my curiosity has been piqued. I'm just saying that I will never see a real-life Barian race. Anyway, early in her career, Theodora was an actress, which Romans actually used to mean, since actor was a byword for stripper, which was a byword for prostitute. Now, it's worth noting that our best source for this period is one dude named Procopius, who wrote a handful of accounts about Justinian and Theodora. Most of them are fairly straightforward and praiseful, but in the Renaissance we discovered his secret history, which goes out of its way to paint the royal pair as duplicitous, malevolent, and extremely slutty. I'm not going to go into details because I like my monetization, thank you very much, but if you're jonesing for a thrill, go look up Secret History Theodora Geese. Now, all this historical shade-throwing notwithstanding, the relationship between Justinian and Theodora was a somewhat unlikely one. Theodora came from a lower class, and her family wasn't a political asset, and there was even a law in place to stop high-ranking officials from marrying actresses. But as soon as the two met, they fell in love, and then Justinian axed the law about not marrying actresses, and they became an unstoppable team. While Justinian focused on the big-picture imperial business, Theodora managed all of the backdoor diplomacy and stopped court frustrations from slipping into conspiracy territory. Early in their career, when rioting sports fans were several days into their quest to burn Constantinople to the ground and Justinian was making plans to escape, Theodora convinced him to stay and face the crisis. A decade later, Justinian had fallen into a coma, and Theodora held the empire together in his absence, dodging what really should have been a civil war. And after Theodora died in 548, Justinian never remarried. And though he kept things moving for the last 17 years of his reign, he was never as sharp as he had been when he had Theodora by his side. Between her and Cleopatra, powerful women in history often get an unfair shake, either treated as footnotes on their husbands and or accused of your standard issue sexual depravity. But regardless, Justinian and Theodora's mutual love and support make them one of history's finest power couples.
That one actually
And
really
finally, you've
hurt.
heard of marrying for political alliances, but what about marrying your way into a
It hurt
brand new
really
country
bad. Oh
and a
my
world-conquering empire at that? Well, that brings us all the way up to the late 1400s, when the kingdoms of Castile, Aragon, and Portugal were wrapping up their 7th century reconquista against the Moors. In 1469, Princess Isabella of Castile had subverted the latest of her brother King Henry's attempts to marry her off to the Prince of Portugal, and instead got herself engaged to her second cousin, Prince Ferdinand of Aragon. Now, an interfamilial pairing like this was not only icky, but explicitly illegal, so Ferdinand and Isabella had to get a formal dispensation to marry from the Vatican itself. Luckily, the Pope in question was none other than Rodrigo Daughter-Banger Borgia, who never so much as blinked at the implications of incest. So that legal roadblock was cleared with unsettling ease, and the happy prince and princess patiently waited to assume their thrones. After Henry of Castile died in 1474 and John of Aragon died in 1479, Isabella and Ferdinand became the sole rulers of the combined kingdom of Castile and Aragon, which stretched across Iberia and all the way to Sicily. From there, it was go time. Following a slew of overhaul reforms to the economy and justice system, Ferdinand and Isabella began a final push into Granada to conquer the last Muslim pocket of Iberia. By 1492, they reconquisted their way to the fortress of Alhambra. To the delight of geometry teachers around the world, they preserved the palace and all of its Islamic artwork, but they were a lot less forgiving on a personal level. Jews and Muslims across Spain were forced to convert or leave, and so the king and queen brought centuries of beautiful religious multiculturalism to a grinding halt. But as you probably know, that is far from the only thing to have happened in 1492, as the monarchs financed the transatlantic voyage of famed Genoan cheesemaker and part-time murderer Christopher Columbus.
Part-time murderer Christopher Columbus.
Colonization and made Spain fabulously rich. Some economists would argue too rich. Though Isabella died in 1504 and Ferdinand died in 1516, the consequences of their marriage affected literally almost everything. Their daughter Joanna inherited the Spanish throne and proceeded to marry into the soon-to-be notorious Habsburg family, whose subsequent empire is inversely proportional to the size of their gene pool. And that is how one frisky family reunion took
Maria
Spain
Antoinette was a Habsburg, and she had a slight
and though I
Habsburg
may
jaw.
be disgusted
but
by
hers
the
was so
context,
slight,
I'm
just
also
made
quite
her
impressed because
her body
Ferdinand and
was a
Isabella
little
are
pouty,
easily one of the most consequential couples in world history.
she was less
Slightly deformed.
She was less inbred than the rest.
Tell us about love. Well, I'd say it's one, given some historians have devoted their entire careers to erasing homosexuality and or slandering every single woman in power, always consider who you take relationship advice from. And yes, I do see the irony in that statement. Two, stay grounded in your relationship. A Roman province is no substitute for honest affection. 3, effective communication and teamwork strategies
I
are
feel like
crucial
something's
steps
wrong
toward
with
a
it.
healthy
Something's off
relationship
about
and
her.
imperial glory. And number 4,
I feel like she's
oh gosh, look at the time. You know, it goes so fast when you're having fun, but that's all we've got here
maybe
today. So
slightly
I'll see you next
autistic
time
or
later. Thank you so much for watching.
Like
There's
something.
many more than just 4 famous couples in world history, so let me know some of your personal favorites, and that way they might appear in next year's Valentine's Day special. Anyway, enjoy the holiday and go get you some discount chocolate. You deserve it.
just the way she talk about emotions and stuff is just weird.
Too emotional.
No, more like Mark Zuckerberg.
Oh, she.
Welcome to
She's a
History
wizard.
Lesson, the
Disjointed.
show where I take a topic and tell you all about why
like she
it's
does
way more
again.
hilarious than you ever could have imagined. Today, we're going to dig into the glories of the Italian Renaissance and
sarcastic
learn about the
tone.
artists
It
who
might be the
actually made it happen.
sarcastic tone,
Because
but-
we've talked about historical context
Oh, and
before,
then I feel like she
we've
gets
discussed
really
famous works,
offended
but we
by
haven't
people
fully
who-
appreciated just how
like the
bonkers
robot
and
video,
badass some of
she
these
felt
artists
some type of way
were.
about,
So, to get a sense of what
asexual
Renaissance
people.
life was like, let's do some
Because she doesn't
we begin at
understand
the turn of
emotion
the
or
1400s when
relationship.
this Renaissance business was
You
just
know.
starting to be reneged. Our first protagonist was
That would
born in
make it
Florence,
harder
a
to
Mr.
be,
Filippo
because-
Brunellesco di Lippo Lappi, who
You know, it makes it harder to be in a relationship.
Sorry.
You don't understand
Sounds
relationship
made up.
cues and shit, you know?
Okay, anyway, Brunelleschi, as he was known, was educated in math and trained as a goldsmith, and he caught his first big break in 1401 when the city held a contest to redecorate the bronze doors of the famous baptistry. As their task, Filippo and 6 other sculptors mocked up
What
one
the
scene from the
fuck?
eventual 8-panel door. To his lifelong frustration, the jury passed on his complex and dramatic scene for the simpler and more classical composition of Lorenzo Ghiberti. Filippo refused to be second best at anything, but he took this loss in stride. Just kidding. He stormed out of Florence immediately and vowed never to sculpt again. And that's pretty indicative of Brunelleschi's temperament. Instead, he devoted his focus to architecture during the years he spent with his pal Donatello in Rome. When he returned to Florence, Brunelleschi's first job was designing the Ospedali degli Innocenti as a radical reconstruction of ancient Roman design. But if you look at those arches, it was also a casual addition for a much larger semicircle, the dome. When the city launched a new design contest in 1418 to finish the as-of-then uncapped Duomo, Brunelleschi smoked his old rival Ghiberti. It may have taken 2 decades, but the revenge was sweet, and it smelled like construction mortar. According to popular legend, architects were tasked to stand an egg upright on a slab of marble, and Filippo's solution was simply to smash the bottom of the egg into a base. This story is almost definitely fabricated, but it is absolutely the kind of dramatic trick that Brunelleschi would pull. Now, when it came to building the dome, hoisting the material 50 meters in the air was only part of the problem, as Filippo's most stubborn components were his workers. For them, just arriving for work all the way up those stairs was enough of a pain in the butt, so when they broke for lunch and went back down, they stayed down and just went home. Brunelleschi's solution was to build a kitchen inside the dome so that his workers had no excuse to bail early. He also watered down their wine because professionals gotta have standards. After the dome was finished, which, by the way, the city held another contest to design the lantern on top, which Ghiberti had the gall to apply for. Brunelleschi would sooner die than let that hack lay a finger on his masterpiece, so Filippo entered and won the competition. He actually had to overcome the slight hiccup of a studio assistant stealing his plans and submitting them as his own work. So Brunelleschi fancied up his own design in secret before submitting it again. Some people have described Brunelleschi's personality as egoistic, perfectionist, rash, and aggressive, and, well, true, these all kind of miss the real point. Filippo Brunelleschi was an absolute diva, plain and
She was
simple.
a
And
diva.
truly, nobody can rediscover the nuances of classical Roman architecture without storming out of their hometown on a decade-long cross-country temper tantrum. A few years later, just outside Florence, we first meet the man so smart it actually makes me angry. Leonardo da Vinci. Born the illegitimate child of a notary and a peasant, the only thing going for our boy Leo was his insatiable curiosity. Italy had painters and natural scientists and maybe even a few talented engineers, but not like this. Leonardo's first job in Florence was in the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio, helping prep and fine-tune the master's paintings. Famously, his work on the angels and water and the baptism of Christ are far better than Verrocchio's own brushwork on Jesus and John. Some stories exaggerate that Verrocchio stormed out and never picked up a paintbrush again, but that's more up Brunelleschi's alley. Though, point stands, Leonardo was flexing on the city's best painters just in his 20s. In 1482, Leonardo sent a job offer to the Duke of Milan in the form of a silver lyre cast in the shape of a horse's skull. I'm gonna breeze past how freaking metal that is and be glad that our kiddo got himself a promotion. For the next 17 years, he worked for the Milanese as a painter and as a theater engineer. Yep, you got that right. Da Vinci did tech. It's here that he worked on his best painting, The Last Supper, where he sometimes painted from dawn until night without a break, and sometimes went days on end without painting anything. The prior of the convent was extremely frustrated with Da Vinci's schedule, so Leonardo very politely asked the Duke if he could use the prior's face as the model for Judas. Oof. After fulfilling his art credit requirement, Leonardo began working on military equipment for the Duke of Milan and eventually for Cesare Borgia, with some notable sketches including a 12-barreled gun and a full-ass tank. Now, it's a good thing Da Vinci was more of a designer than an inventor because these things are straight-up nightmare fuel, but we can tell from his notes that he didn't want anybody building it. He deliberately drew the gearbox for his tank backwards so that the wheels would lock and the machine would be useless. Aside from the murder wagon, Leonardo designed a helicopter, a parachute, a flying machine, and even a metal robot, but we only discovered his metric tank-loaded inventions when his notebooks were published decades later. See, for most of his life, and a good couple centuries after his death, Leonardo was primarily known as a painter, and everybody could see that he understood the human form, but it was only when we cracked open his notebooks that we figured out why. Da Vinci sketched dozens of living figures during trips to and from the market, but he also dissected corpses to understand things like muscle structure and how our eyes process light. Slightly illegal, yes, point taken, but Leonardo's anatomy studies also gave us the Vitruvian Man,
Leonardo
the
da
apex of T-posing. Anyway,
It's a
Da Vinci
whole
hopped around
side
between
mission in
Florence and Milan and
Assassin's Creed
eventually
2
to
where you got
France
steal
before dying
bodies
in
of Leonardo.
1519. For all his
That
varying
was
talents, his
okay.
greatest strength was still the curiosity to
I mean,
investigate.
if it wasn't for him, we wouldn't have any bombing today or know anything about the inside of the body.
Yeah, right, nigga.
Now, the
Still
shortest
think that
but
disease came from
easiest
miasma.
story on this list will follow the life and
No,
times
who
and
stopped the
murder
miasma
of
thing?
Benvenuto
The guy who finally
Cellini,
stopped the
the
miasma
only
thing.
Renaissance
His name was
artist who
John
acts
Snow.
like there's somebody psychotic Dungeons and
Because
Dragons
y'all
character.
remember I was
Born in
listening to an
1500 and given a
episode
goldsmithing
of this
apprentice in
podcast will kill you
1515,
and
he
they
was
have
banished
Game
from
of
the city of
Thrones
Florence just a year later for starting a Romeo and Juliet Act 1 Scene 1 brawl. So he moved to Rome, where he ended up defending the city against a disastrous sacking by renegade Bourbon troops. Now, our source for Cellini is, unfortunately, Cellini, whose wildly extravagant autobiography claims that he single-handedly saved a castle as well as being the one to shoot and kill Duke Charles of Bourbon. Cellini's autobiography is particularly frustrating because it is a decent source for daily Renaissance life so long as you don't listen to anything that he says about himself. 2 years after the sack, a Roman guard was killed by Benvenuto's brother, who was in turn killed by another guard who Benvenuto later killed. He also got into a fistfight with a notary and killed a rival goldsmith, which at this point is just par for the course. Though he briefly fled from Rome, the Pope later absolved him. Still, that makes Cellini 2 for 2 on exiles. Funny thing is, when he returned to Rome, he was arrested on embezzlement charges and thrown in prison, where after he did escape, but was immediately recaptured. For a hot minute, he worked at the French royal court, but he was frustrated that he couldn't solve his disagreements by murdering them, so Cellini returned to Florence. He did try to multi-class into being a priest, of all things, but he swiftly gave it up. Wonder whether it was the rules on no murder, no philandering, or worshipping somebody other than himself that sealed the deal. As for his art career, it's a recurring theme that his ability to consistently create art was serially jeopardized by his near-constant run-ins with the law. His best work, Perseus with the Head of Medusa, is partially a result of him being too old to commit casual murder on his way to and from his workshop. By all accounts, he would have been a much more prolific artist if he wasn't so much of a narcissistic murder hobo. Though if we ask Benvenuto himself, I think he'd be pretty satisfied with his choice. This last person on our list isn't technically a Renaissance artist, but technically I'm the
He was a
one in charge.
narcissist, he was a murderer, and he was a hobo.
Now, this story begins in 1590s Rome, right on the edge of the Baroque period, where the master Caravaggio and his old pal Orazio Tintoreschi were working together on various projects throughout the city. In 1593, Orazio
giving up for this motherfucker Leonardo DiCaprio.
I've been listening to a podcast about a murder hobo, not enough
instantly DQ'd from any of the artists.
His name Samuel Little.
Was only returned to have owned a workshop that she even had a shot at painting. That said, it did
Kinda
actually
just
Judith
drifting
rapidly
around
picked up some
the
of Caravaggio's talent.
lower
for
United
exploration,
States
writing,
for
and
the better part of 40
now,
years
this is the
murdering
part
people.
where Artemisia's story gets extremely uncomfortable
Murder
to
robot?
retell, but
Yeah, I
art is
guess so.
fundamentally inseparable from her
Never
trauma.
laid that,
So
never
he
put
ends up
down
her
somewhere long
assault. At
enough
the
to
age
be
of
somewhere, but
17,
guess
she
where
was
his
raped by an
grandparents
artist
lived and he
named
came back to alive.
who was working on a project
Lorraine,
called
Ohio.
And then, this colossal shithead
Yeah,
then promised
But
to
he did most of his murders in Florida and
but
California.
kept on finding
Texas and
excuses to delay
Georgia.
the wedding so that the
Tennessee.
relationship would continue with no strings attached, except for the omnipresent psychological garrote wire. But never mind that. After about a year, Mr. Gentileschi found out about this and immediately took Tassi to court. Artemisia's testimony was verified by thumbscrew torture, and at one point she called out to Agostino that her thumbscrews were the wedding ring he promised. This, dear viewers, is our first major indication that Artemisia Gentileschi takes no shit. The trial would go on to reveal that Tassi was an even greater scumbag than anybody could imagine, but despite his conviction, he was later pardoned by the Pope. So Artemisia, 100% done with Rome, hopped up to Florence. But before she left, she completed her first major painting of Susanna and the Elders, a Bible story reframed to show how wildly uncomfortable it is to be accosted while you're trying to mind your own damn business. And this marks only the start of Artemisia taking thematic cues from her own experience, because her next painting was her interpretation of the famous Caravaggio of Judith slaying Philophanes.
Oh, he going back and forth down here. Okay.
Because look at this. Caravaggio, buddy, your Judith has never held a sword in her life. She needs to put her shoulders into it. Now, there we go. Artemisia knows what I'm talking about. That's how you decapitate a man. See what I mean? Gentileschi was no slouch, and you can tell exactly what was going through her mind when she was painting that. She's not just a good artist, or a good artist despite the limitations on women. She was great because her work was so uncompromising and vividly autobiographical. Her fame quickly spread, and her time in Florence saw her painting for the Medici court and earning a spot on the Accademia di Arte del Disegno, and soon enough she was painting for clients in Venice, Naples, and even the King of England. After Artemisia's death in the mid-1650s, she fell off the artistic radar for a few centuries, but since the feminist movement in the 1970s, there's been a huge resurgence of interest in Artemisia, and for damn good reason. Her art shows how all of us can take trauma and turn it into something powerful. Taking the old stabby stab revenge will just cause more legal issues, but taking revenge through art means that everybody can get some much needed catharsis. So, what have we learned? Well, if you're gonna be a diva, you gotta back it up with talent. And no matter what your field, it always helps to be curious. Be mindful of your work-life balance. Balance includes murder. And finally, when you find yourself in a rough situation, ask yourself, what would Artemisia Gentileschi do? Because in every situation, the answer is take no shit. Alright, thank you so much for watching, and thanks to our fantastic patrons who voted on the name for this new series. If you'd like to have a say in what's coming up next, or have your name in the credits like these cool cats, hop on over to patreon.com/OSP. Catch you all in the next video.
You ready to try to do yours? Oh, I guess after this next one, try to do yours.
Diplomacy is complicated. You have to manage competing interests and work cooperatively to ensure the best final outcome. Luckily, there is another, much more efficient option: murder. Because once you leap over those pesky little speed bumps like the worth of human life, it becomes so much easier to solve your problems by just unexisting with people who disagree with you. You know, like a psychopath. But despite the nominal simplicity of huck a javelin through his abdomen, killing people can be surprisingly labor-intensive and make mistakes, especially when the target is some political bigwig. So, to have a laugh at the expense of some of the most notorious failed assassins, let's do some history. Our first story takes us to the eastern edge of the Mediterranean at the tail end of the
Okay, Blue's grown on me.
Everybody involved.
I used to not like him, but I think he just jarred me the first time I saw, like, what the fuck are you and where did you come from? Just like that shit was popping up in,
was under threat of sabotage, and in 120 BC,
Ryan's video.
was poisoned by
Like, who the fuck are you and where did you come from? But, you know, I give you a chance, you're okay. You're okay.
While he was wandering
Don't scare me like that.
this building support for a
And the chick is cool. She just kind of, she's really loud. That's the only thing. She keeps yelling at me, so it's all about that. But other than that, fine.
The logic being that he ingested all of the poisons imaginable in small doses, he could build up an immunity to it and become invincible. So after 7 long years in the woods getting blasted on tree frogs and vipers, the prince returned to his capital, Sinope, and threw his way into becoming king Mithridates VI. With crown on head and kingdom in hand, Mithridates set about doing 2 things: expanding his state to prepare against the Roman threat, and doing way the hell more poison. And now that the king had graduated from his days of just eating stuff and seeing what happens, he was going to use his royal resources to be scientific about this. He built a series of poison labs to source more elaborate ingredients, test new concoctions on prisoners, develop tailored antidotes, and of course get more poison to snack on. No, His Highness the King does not have a poison addiction. He can stop anytime he wants. But why stop?
Damn, I thought it was
tricks like keeping down snake venom. Now the thing is, part of me feels bad for leaning so hard on Mithridates because he was an extremely learned king that collected massive libraries, could speak well over a dozen languages, and grew the small kingdom into a Black Sea empire. But on the other hand, funny haha poison man, so my hands are tied. Mithridates likely survived several assassination attempts, but we'll never really know how many because none of them worked. Of course, like everybody else in the ancient Mediterranean, his downfall was Rome. His grand strategy was to incite a revolt in western Anatolia and Greece to let disgruntled Romans do what they do best. The confusion of mass slaughter made great cover for Mithridates' march into Roman territory, and he managed to get in a spirited back and forth for a good 2 decades before Rome stopped compulsively slapping itself in the face and actually started trying. Eventually, General Pompey, soon to be Pompey the Great, later to be Pompey the Headless, stomped the Pontic army and forced Mithridates to flee across the Black Sea to Crimea. After failing to raise another army, he decided it was better to just die than to get paraded in a Roman triumph. So with his back against the wall, Mithridates killed himself by poison. Except he did not, because he was immune. Plan B was asking a friend of his to do him a solid and just stab him. It's lucky he didn't supplement his daily poison regimen with doses of tiny knives, or else he really would have been screwed. And so King Mithridates died as he lived. Not dying from poison.
He died as he lived,
Now,
not dying from poison.
is enough of an endeavor, but as time goes on, administrations evolve, and power often gets distributed to launch entire things. This makes it infinitely more difficult to off an entire government at once. But luckily, the 1600s are a wonderful time full of such modern marvels as high explosives, and some enterprising lads wanted to make use of this new tech. So, let's set the scene. England has been ruled by Protestants for nearly a century, and they were making life increasingly suckish for the English Catholic holdouts. And since England's Anglican monarchs kept butting heads with very Catholic Spain and getting excommunicated by the very Catholic Pope, adherence to the Church in Rome was treated on par with being an enemy of the state. This was an extremely complex mesh of religious and political factors that would require a delicate touch to overcome. Or, blow up Parliament. No fuss, no persuasion checks, just an ass ton of explosives. That was the logic of these fine morons. Robert Catesby, Guy Fawkes, and 10 other Catholics conspiring to destroy the Protestant government of England under the new King James I. The scariest part of the story is that the plan might have worked if the conspirators shared more than 5 brain cells between them. For instance, step 1 was renting an apartment next to the Palace of Westminster under the bulletproof alias of John Johnson, which must have made the landlord think, ah yes, Mr. John Johnson, he must have a respectable career of doing job at place. They then spent weeks hauling 36 full barrels of gunpowder into the apartment in advance of Parliament's reopening, but boomifying an entire government body was only part of the scheme, as they planned to start a revolt in the countryside and capture the king's Catholic daughter to install her as a puppet queen. And lastly, they'd sail over to Europe to get the Pope to support the new Catholic government and pretty please forgive us for all of the murder. So that was the idea, but Parliament was closed for most of the year because of plague, mood, and wouldn't reopen until November 5th. That left a lot of time for the conspirators to ruminate on the moral implications of terrorism. Not because murder was wrong or anything silly like that, but because they had some friends in Parliament. So despite strict orders not to send any warnings to anybody, one of the conspirators sent a, hey, maybe not go to Parliament note to his buddy. Now this alarm bell wrapped in a red flag had the easily foreseeable consequence of getting reported straight to the Chamberlain, who proceeded to search the entirety of Parliament on the night before the plot. Imagine their surprise to find a lone gentleman standing next to a pile of firewood and 36 barrels of gunpowder in an otherwise empty apartment. A gentleman who insists that his name is John Johnson.
My name is John Johnson! John Johnson!
Fox was shocked the constable saw through his ironclad disguise. Fox was subsequently tortured into giving up the names of his co-conspirators who were busy up in the countryside failing to start their revolt. Unfortunately, their excess storage of gunpowder had gotten soaked, so these big brain boys laid it out to dry in front of a fire, which is just the most apt visual metaphor for a plant blowing up in your face. The crew was captured and executed, and for the next century and change, British Catholics were treated even harsher because of their association with the gunpowder plot, even losing the right to vote until 1829. Nice job ending that religious persecution. Good work, team. Now, I was originally going to wrap this
Up
video
there
with
right
the
there.
story
Oh.
of either Rasputin or Fidel Castro, but Rasputin did end up getting shot to death, so he's disqualified, and the only thing more numerous than the CIA's 600 assassination attempts on Castro is the amount of low-effort listicles about it. Instead, we're going to ignore the rest of the world and cozy up in Venice. So, the Venetian Republic. The longest lasting and best government in world history, I need not say more. But sometimes, rarely, the Serenissima made some tactical errors. In 1310, Venice had ruffled enough Vatican feathers to earn themselves an interdict, in which the Pope smacks the Holy Banhammer onto an entire city. This was bad news for a mercantile island republic with approximately 4 square feet of arable land. As the man in charge of this mess, Doge Gradenigo was immensely disliked and had to take draconian steps to quell all the unrest. In a dicey situation like this, Venetian nobles had the option to A, deal with it, or B, riot. So with the Great British Boom House still a couple centuries off, how did this conspiracy go down? Well, it started with a handful of sleepy nobles and one Biomonte Tiepolo, the grandson of a former doge and a man with no qualms about fucking the Republic off a bridge and installing himself as despot. These gents were all but certain that scores of Venetian nobles and commoners alike would join in their quest to stab the doge in the face, so they sent out a lot of feelers to their friends around town. But coup is a strong word, and some people were distinctly not on board and did the responsible thing of reporting the conspiracy right to the doge. But even if the conspirators knew to expect a veritable party bus of guards, their more pressing concern was weather, namely the springtime lightning storms. See, their foolproof plan was to take 2 groups across town and raise the citizens to arms before meeting in St. Mark's Square to storm the Doge's palace. But when they charged through the streets at dawn and started shouting, "Liberty! Death to the Doge!" nobody could hear them over the sound of thunder and pouring rain. And anybody who liked what these guys were selling weren't about to go running into a storm at 6 a.m. The West group ran smack into a band of the Doge's guards and might have regrouped if not for some priests and painters on their way to work who took the initiative to waylay the conspirators a second time. Tiepolo's East group had similar luck, gaining exactly 0 sympathetic rebels. In fact, Venetians were opening their windows specifically to shout insults, and got to be outdone when behind old Senior Rossi heard the commotion while doing her morning chores, and when she opened her window, she dropped, or maybe threw, her stone mortar at the conspirators, landing square on the head of the standard bearer and killing him instantly. Tiepolo saw his comrade drop dead in front of him and took it as a sign that this was just not his morning, so he ran away and politely accepted his banishment. Meanwhile, old lady Rossi was hailed as a hero for her ingenuity and impeccable aim. As her reward, she simply asked to fly a Venetian flag on feast days and for her landlord to never raise the rent on her family home so long as the Republic endured. Now, this was a god-tier play, because Venice took the conspiracy as a hint to reform, to better avoid future treason, but also to improve the government's overall efficiency, which combined to give the Venetian Republic another 5 centuries of life. I mean, sure, Tiepolo and his conspirators made a series of fatal mistakes in their slapdash plot to kill the Doge, but oh boy, if they only knew that Signora Rossi was waiting for them, these fools would have stayed the hell home. So, aside from some boring nerd morals about how murder isn't a cure-all, what have we learned today? Well, Mithridates should have been more careful with what he wished for in his poison immunity, so the rest of us should probably lay off the arsenic and stick to alcohol as our poison of choice. Meanwhile, Guy Fawkes is proof that the best laid plans are only as strong as your dumbest nickname. And finally, Divine Smite comes in many forms, and Old Venetian Ladies and Stoneware is a good one to look out for. Thank you so much for watching. As I'm sure you could tell, this video was a blast to work on, so I've got to thank the patrons for voting for it. You guys are the real MVPs. Of course, history is long and people can be kind of morons sometimes, so there's no dearth of other hilarious failed plots. So leave a comment with your favorite, and I may double back to cover some more of these stories in the future. You never know. Alright, see you in the next video.
This video was sponsored by Campfire. More on that later. Howdy y'all, welcome to the video. There comes a moment in every character's development when the writer must ask themselves, what does this character sound like? Maybe I think this guy's gotta sound tough and coarse, like he really means business. Or perhaps they must sound ancient and ethereal, by which I of course mean kinda British. Or maybe you'll just do your best Scottish, even though your only exposure to the accent has been Gimli and Scrooge McDuck. Or maybe you'll just go for the Nick Cage impression. A character's character really comes through in their voice. In written media, that's a narrative voice, the tone they're written in. But in media with an audio component, it's a literal voice. While you might think that audio media would have a serious advantage in this category, prose can be really good at communicating a distinct narrative voice. The written word is a very impressive thing. But there's some trickiness there right off the bat. See, language is very weird conceptually, and it changes very quickly. Try getting a laugh with what are those these days. So unless the story you're writing is taking place in a time and place that matches up with the version of the language you're writing in, there's liable to be some dissonance between the story and the language it's written in. Lots of 60s sci-fi is set in the future, sometimes even the past by now, but it still has some hallmarks of the 60s baked into the language, and it still feels very much of its time. Obviously, the ideal course of action to avoid this kind of dating would be to write in a totally formal and neutral form of the language, which, while theoretically free of watermarks in the era, also doesn't work, because even the formal textbook stuff changes over time. How many of you are properly using the and thou these days? There is no such thing as dialect-free language. Since slang has a tendency to creep in from social context, language is buried in the social context it's used in, and when a dialect forms, that social context is really used in. Every form of language has associations, and it's most obvious with accents. Every dialect has at least one accent, and all language is subdivided into dialects. There's no such thing as unaccented speech, just like there's no dialect-free speech. And because accents are rooted in dialects, and dialects are rooted in specific social contexts, accents carry some of that context with them. Now, the thing is, most people don't really think they speak with an accent. Everyone sounds normal to their own ears. There's this false dichotomy between has an accent and doesn't have an accent, and writers fall into this very noticeably if they decide to write a character with a specific accent. For instance, Bram Stoker loved giving his side characters nearly incomprehensible transcribed accents, while his main characters, with the exception of the definitely American Quincy Morris, have no phonetic accent and are generally using dictionary-accurate English. But from the narrative voice, it's still pretty clear what accent is supposed to be spoken. Some sentences like, "Here I am, who shall be 20 in September, and yet I never had a proposal till today," not a real proposal, and today I have had 3, just fancy, just don't sound right in my neutral accent, or any accent but posh British. And then there's Quincy, whose lines don't sound right in any accent. "Miss Lucy, I know I ain't good enough to regulate the fixings of your little shoes, but I guess if you wait till you find a man that is, you will go join them 7 young women with the lamps when you quit. Won't you just hitch up alongside of me and let us go down the long road together, driving in double harness?" So writers usually write in their own neutral language, which is, of course, a uniquely personal dialect and accent that still registers as normal to them due to familiarity. And when they want to single out a character as outside that normal, well, sometimes they give him an accent they find outside the normal, hoping to carry the associations they have with that accent. Since language is steeped in implications, this is one of the most efficient ways to get across some structural character traits. In theory. In practice, because language is so steeped in implications, this can be a bit like trying to paint on a little bit of smoky eye and accidentally dropping the entire house race section on someone. Of course, sometimes characters just get given accents because they're fun. It's not always that deep. In cases when that's true, it's just as casual as any other character trait. We made this character have this accent because they're from this place or because it's fun, and that's as far as it goes. But while sometimes an accent is just an accent, sometimes it's meant to signal more than that. And that's where things start getting complicated. But before we dive into accents and how they're used in fiction, specifically accents of English, we have to address why this story is written in English at all. Many stories take place in settings that aren't specifically the English-speaking regions of modern-day Earth. In fact, they may have very little to do with Earth at all. And English is a serious hot mess of a language with its linguistic development rooted in a lot of goofy and highly specific historical shenanigans. How do we justify its presence in a story or world that doesn't line up with the version of the language we're using? Now, the realistic or dualist explanation is that the story is written in modern English because it's being written by a writer who's fluent in it and intended for an audience who's also fluent in it. And as narratively accurate as it might be to write the whole thing in your own personal conlang, the goal of the story is to be read, so you probably want to make it readable. Finnegan's Wake is purposely written in not contemporary English, and it's notorious for being nigh incomprehensible. But like all dualist explanations, this requires a little suspension of disbelief, and since we're asking the question, we're clearly not suspending disbelief. Specifically, we are harpooning our disbelief out of the sky for the purposes of narrative analysis. So let's look at the in-universe or Watsonian explanation. Now, this explanation can vary a lot. Sometimes it's just not addressed, which is fine most of the time. Like I said, suspension of disbelief. Totally fair to handwave the language you're writing in, because what else can you be reasonably expected to do? Then some stories write in stuff like universal translators, especially popular in sci-fi narratives, though there's still no explanation as to why the version of English the translators default to is the same one that was popular when the story was made. And then, as always, there's Tolkien setting the high bar of insanity with the ultimate explanation for why his fantasy epics are written in English, specifically that he translated them into English. In the meta-narrative around The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, Tolkien claims that he's drawing on a primary source called the Red Book of Westmarch, specifically several annotated and edited copies of the original manuscript, which was written by Bilbo but lost to history. He's basically deriving this from the Norse Edda, where the originals were also not available. This original story would have been written in one of the many conlangs Tolkien created for this world, and The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings were just translations and compilations from this original source text. The names aren't even the same. Like Merry, full name Meriadoc, who was supposedly originally named Chilibanzar, which was shortened to Chillick, which meant happy or merry. So in the process of translating, quote-unquote, Tolkien renamed him Meriadoc, which could be shortened directly. This is the high bar explanation for why the story is in English when the original has no reason to be, and it's also a convenient segue into an extremely relevant topic: localization. Localization is a term that will be painfully familiar to anime fans. It describes the process by which a story is translated, rewritten, and adapted to appeal to a specific regional audience. It essentially attempts to recontextualize the story so that this new audience can appreciate it in the same way its original audience would appreciate it. Mapping unfamiliar context from the original into a more familiar parallel, attempting to reproduce the original vibe, which was lost when the story was removed from its source context. Kind of like those early 2000s reimaginings of Shakespeare plays into modern settings, Tolkien renames his characters Merry and Pippin because to his audience in mid-1900s England, those names would have sounded cheerful and homey to match the characters, where the original names of Chillick and Razal would sound weird and alien. Of course, since he was making up the original story and localizing it kind of backwards, this is a dubious example. Unlike the case of Lysistrata, a comedic play written by Aristophanes in the 400s BC, wherein the women of Athens and Sparta worked together to end the Peloponnesian War by refusing to bone the men until they cut it out. I read a translation of it in high school and noticed something very weird about the Spartan character Lampedo. She was written with a very noticeable Scottish accent. Recognizing that this play had been written in ancient Greek, I asked my teacher where the heck that accent had come from, and she told me that the author of our translation was British. The logic had basically been that to the Athenian audience, the Spartans were crude, violent brawlers, so Sparta was to Athens as Scotland was to England. Basically, it's a big old stereotype full of ethnic humor. Isn't that fun? It's not just England, by the way, since the English perception of Scotland isn't the same as, say, the American perception of Scotland or the Scottish perception of Scotland. Other translations localize with different accents to carry the same implications. For instance, American translations of Lysistrata often suggest an Appalachian accent. So the translator for Lysistrata localized the play to an English audience by telling them these Spartans were basically Scots. And they weren't the only ones. Thanks to Jared Butler's dulcet tones, the Spartans in 300 also sound Scottish, except for the Queen. She gets the sound English. In fact, English seems to be the official accent of all of human history, since everyone from Roman emperors to French revolutionaries will be inexplicably extremely British. Les Mis has this bad. We show that the students at the barricades are classy because of their mild BBC English accents, and then we show that Gavroche is a low-class gutter snipe by giving him a Cockney accent. In France, lest we forget. The use of accents in fiction is often a tool to localize a narrative by leveraging local stereotypes to map to less familiar stereotypes. We might not be able to recognize a low-class French accent, so when we translate it into English, we use Cockney as the code instead. Though, of course, we Americans only recognize Cockney as the stereotypical low-class accent because it gets used that way so much. It's pretty circular. And accents don't always have to be linked with ethnic stereotypes. Consider talking like a pirate when you gotta get across that you're pirates, for instance. That accent has the distinction of being almost completely made up, too, which I guess just proves that you don't need to leverage existing stereotypes when building your fictional demographics. Anyway, classical literature aside, localization was also a serious concern in the earlier days of anime dubbing. This might sound weird in the post-simul world we live in, where anime has infiltrated every level of our society, but back in the day, the idea that Americans might enjoy Japanese television was extremely controversial. At minimum, it was kind of untested, so when dubbing companies started trying to dub anime for a mainstream American audience, sometimes they made some pretty significant changes to make it more palatable. The dubbing company 4Kids was kind of notorious for this. When they dubbed Pokemon, for instance, they would systematically scrape out any and all references to Japanese culture, including the food. Rice balls would be crudely photoshopped out and replaced with things like crackers or sub sandwiches. They'd also rename characters, which was more notable in how they did Yu-Gi-Oh! Japanese names like Jonochi Katsuya, Anzu, and Honda became Joey Wheeler, Taya, and Tristan. And this is also where they really went ham on the accents. Those of you who watch the dub or are otherwise familiar with the Yu-Gi-Oh! The Abridged series will know that Joey has an extremely noticeable Brooklyn accent, and Bakura has a British accent. Neither of these make all that much sense in context. Everyone seems to have kind of grown up in roughly the same neighborhood, but the accents are there anyway. This is because, in the original Japanese, both characters had fairly distinct styles of speech, styles that don't translate into English very easily. Japanese has some very specific modes of formality in speech, ranging from a very informal mode used when talking with close friends or family, up to a very formal mode that can sound almost archaic in daily use. Joey, or Jonochi, notably uses the absolute least formal speech no matter who he's talking to, because he's a pretty brash, rude guy without an ounce of respect for authority. It doesn't really matter to him if he's talking to his best friend or a bazillionaire CEO, he'll be casual just the same. And in contrast, Bakura speaks extremely formally. Most of his lines could come out of a textbook. No slang, informality, or abbreviation anywhere. This doesn't apply to his evil alter ego, by the way. It's just polite. So when localizing, the translators gave Joey a thick Brooklyn accent and Bakura a British accent to clue the audience in that Joey was loud and rude and that Bakura was formal and polite. And while it wasn't strictly an accent, when translating for Yugi and Yami, they had to deal with the fact that Yugi describes himself with a personal pronoun Oku, which just means I, but has implications of youth or immaturity, while Yami uses Ore, which but has implications of masculinity, maturity, and superiority. So while the original Japanese version made Yami kind of sounding a little more confident, the dub also made Yami sound considerably older with a much deeper voice. What's interesting is that their localization efforts actually kind of flattened one of the characters. The villain, Pegasus, was an American in the original Japanese version, and he talked really, really weirdly. He would use English words in place of Japanese words almost at random, and he handled honorifics really bizarrely. Japanese appends honorifics to names. You don't just call someone by their name, you append something like kun or san or sama or chan. They mean stuff like Mr. or Miss or Lord or imply diminutives like kid. Pegasus would append boy, like the English word boy in place of kun, which kind of means boy, but you would never use them interchangeably. And he still does this in English, though, calling people like Bible boy and stuff. But while it's still pretty weird, it loses the context of how staggeringly bizarre he sounded in the original Japanese. He was like the inverse of that person who sprinkles random Japanese into their English because they've gotten way into anime and they think that's sufficient to learn a language. They probably should be saying stuff like, "Konnichiwa, everybody! I'd like to welcome you to my Simply Sugoi tournament." So specifically giving a character an accent is usually meant to code to the audience that this character is intended to carry associations of that accent, whereas not giving a character an explicit accent leaves it implied to be neutral. Though as we've discussed, there still is an accent present, just one considered neutral by the author. Bram Stoker's non-Quincy, non-Van Helsing main characters still sound strange when read in a non-English accent because the accent is connected with the dialect, and the dialect the book uses is fairly standard highbrow English. But because those characters speak in a similar dialect to the one used in the narration, it comes across as a neutral accent. We're not supposed to infer anything about those characters from their speech patterns, unlike the goofy foreign Dr. Van Helsing or the bold American cowboy Quincy Morris. Now, like all coding, this is very tricky to do, and it's easy to accidentally communicate associations you don't mean. It can also be hard to distinguish traits of the character from traits of the stereotype you're coding. Tolkien's elves may have talked kind of posh British in the movie, but derivative elves in other works often also act posh British, where the originals were just very ancient and alien. And how many traits of modern fantasy dwarves borrow from Tolkien's complex originals instead of just dipping into the well of Scottish stereotypes that got attached by the movie? When you're coding a character, you have less control than you might want over how the audience reads the character. The other difficulty, of course, is that because language changes surprisingly quickly, the coding can also change out from under you. Stoker's use of transcribed phonetic accents probably carried a lot of associations at the time, but nowadays they're really incomprehensible. It's hard enough to understand what the characters were even saying, let alone what stereotypes were supposed to be assigning them. The problem with localizing or coding for an audience is it only works on that specific audience, and as time and society marches on, the coding loses some of the context that made it work in the first place. Let's see. Sometimes an accent is just an accent, sometimes it's a lot more than that, and sometimes that can be a problem. Language is weird, writing is hard, accents are deceptively hard, and if you think you're good at one, you're probably wrong. So, yeah. And thanks again to Campfire for sponsoring this video. Campfire Pro is a writing software designed to help writers stay organized while they work. It's got character pages to help keep everyone's bios straight, plot and story timelines to nail down the actual story beats, corkboard-style maps to keep the locations straight, and character arcs so you can keep an eye on everyone's narrative trajectory. While that's already really useful, you might want to spring for the world-building pack, an expansion on the base Campfire Pro that adds support for species, magic systems, items, and plenty of tools for building out culture with components like religions, philosophies, and languages. For if you want to go full Tolkien with the combos and really lean into the context and accents. Conveniently, Campfire Pro has a 10-day free trial to let you get a feel for the software, and if you do decide to spring for it after that, it's a one-time purchase of $49.99. The World Building Pro Pack is an optional add-on for another $24.99, also one time, and once you've got it forever. Pretty slick. So if this sounds interesting, check out the link in the description. Stop me if you've heard this one. Everyone say hello to our new protagonist. They're such a goofball, you gotta wonder if they even know where they are half the time. They're so silly, and yet their stupidity is strangely endearing. But oh no, plot is happening and something dangerous is threatening our idiot hero. How on earth will they cope? What's this? Our idiot hero seems to be much less of an idiot now than they were a second ago. How are they beating this guy so effortlessly? What just happened? Congratulations, you've just met the crouching moron hidden badass, a popular character across all genres of literature who's pretty much exactly what it says on the tin. This character looks and acts like an idiot, but hiding just below the goofy surface is a grade A badass just waiting for a chance to be underestimated and show off how confident they really are. Now there are several flavors of CMHBs. While they all share the key characteristic of being perceived as a goofball while being capable of being a badass, the way that internally manifests varies from archetype to archetype. For example, let's look at the faker CMHB, the character who is a stone-cold badass but puts puts up a veneer of wackiness, usually either to throw people off their guard or just because they genuinely like being silly, and to a certain extent they prefer to just pretend that they're a lovable goof instead of a terrifyingly competent murder machine. The faker archetype frequently comes with a dark and troubled past to explain why they're so averse to being openly badass, but are still willing to bust out the old moves when the situation gets dire enough. But sometimes they're just goofing off in their downtime. Also, sometimes the faker is an old mentor type who plays up the retired old person angle to get themselves underestimated, then busts out some surprise ability when the going gets tough. A step more extreme than the faker is the split personality CMHB archetype, where the character's moron and badass personalities are literally separate people. The badass half has a tendency to stay dormant unless absolutely necessary, but will often make dramatic appearances when the moron half is out of their depth. Frequently, the moron half won't know the badass half exists, at least at the start. Also, this variant shows up as a brain-damaged anime girl with amnesia a solid 90% of the time. I don't know why that is, and I kinda don't want to know. This is the laziest version of this trope, honestly. Rather than developing a multifaceted character, it takes an utterly useless character and sticks him in the same body as a competent but generic and frequently kind of evil character and has them switch places as the plot demands. This gives you two uninteresting characters instead of one interesting character. On the opposite end of the spectrum is the man-child variant, which is almost the ultimate fusion of the CMHB. This character is, at all times, capable of being both a moron and a badass. They're a goofball, but that doesn't impede their competence at whatever it is they're good at. They're a badass, but that doesn't stop them from goofing around or not taking things seriously. Rather than switching between two distinct modes where they're either serious or silly with no overlap, the man-child almost never drops the silliness completely, and will instead dial it back gradually as necessary. The man-child is extremely sincere and often quite self-aware of their silliness, but not always. On the far moron end of the bell curve, this character is more like a generalized idiot who's surprisingly good at a select few things, and outside of those things will be barely functional. This contrasts with a similar variant, the zero-confidence goofball CMHB. This character is pretty much unaware of their badassery. They know they're a goofball, and they frequently have hang-ups about being so ridiculous and messing things up, but without them realizing it, they're actually very capable in at least one skill set. The zero-confidence goofball shares traits with the man-child in that they seamlessly blend their silliness and their seriousness, but in this case, it's usually because they don't fully process that they're doing anything exceptionally badass. Usually, when it's pointed out to them, they first dismiss that as just a normal thing and then get very excited. The zero-confidence goofball can be relied on to be very competent and badass when the situation is dire, and will usually have a character arc centered on gaining some self-confidence. A fairly specialized variant is the shonen protagonist, or the Goku if you want to be overt. See, most shonen heroes are based on Goku one way or another, which means on average they care about only three things: food, fighting, and friendship. And most of the time, these guys are really goofy when they're not doing the fighting thing. But when they get pissed, usually as the result of one of their friends being threatened or hurt, they kick into serious mode and start single-mindedly trying to fight whoever's responsible. They are simple folk. They are morons until circumstances persuade them to be badasses. These characters often develop an in-universe reputation for ludicrous power as they ass-kick their way through the seasons, but that never seems to stop people from underestimating them when they meet face-to-face and find out that this walking, talking force of nature thinks marriage is something you eat. Generally, the shonen protagonist is a bona fide idiot who happens to make up for their brain deficiency by being ludicrously talented at kicking ass. So whenever the situation devolves into a good old-fashioned punch-up, they get their chance to shine. An even more specialized variant is the second fiddle, which is more of a quirk of how protagonist group dynamics form. See, in a lot of group-oriented shows with like a five-man band as the focus, the main hero will be a super badass and their lancer will be slightly less powerful than them, but still serve as a rival. In cases where this rivalry is played for comedy, the lancer will lose every time they clash with the leader, and it'll be funny every time. What this means is that you have a character who's only required to lose when they fight the hero, but is objectively very powerful on their own, as their second fiddle to the best of the best. But we're only reminded of that power when they're allowed to fight someone who isn't the main hero. So in the group dynamic, the second fiddle will play up the comedy factor, but in a solo combat situation, they'll be allowed to show off their badassery. The CMHB is one of my favorite character tropes, but it's not exactly a personal preference. CMHBs are tailor-made to do two things: be funny and be awesome. And guess what? People like funnies and people like awesome, and I'm people. The CMHB is the perfect storm of humor and hell yeah, or at least they are when they're well written. The CMHB is ideally designed so that at all times they provoke one of two responses: that's funny, or oh, that's awesome. They're an attempt to get the best of two worlds: comic relief and awesome badass, without having to deal too much with character complexities or other frustrations. See, purely comic relief characters have one glaring problem. By their nature, they are useless to the plot. They're just there to punctuate the plot by cheering up the audience. So a lot of comic relief characters will have their personalities supplemented by traits that help them function in a plot-relevant situation. Oddly, making them snipers is strangely common. So is making them hackers. The CMHB is a highly polished version of this. It takes a comic relief character and makes them competent. Antagonists expect comic relief and are blindsided by badassery. Ideally, the CMHB retains the audience cheering properties of the comic relief as well as the awesome heroics of the badass, and even gains a quality outside the sum of its parts by hitting the audience audience with surprise heroics. We expect badassery from the resident badass. When it comes from the comic relief, we're pleasantly surprised. In its perfect form, the CMHB is a whole character with benefits greater than the sum of its archetypes. However, this only works when the CMHB doesn't come across as annoying to the audience, and there's a lot of ways to screw that up. For one, a major trait of the CMHB is that they're chronically underestimated. If they're not being seen as a moron, then the moment where they pull out the badassery loses impact. So in general, anyone about to get whacked with the badass side is only expecting to see the moron side. But sometimes you run into the issue where the CMHB is badass so regularly and so visibly that it makes no sense for anyone to underestimate them anymore. You can disengage an audience if every single one of your antagonists comes across as a total idiot for writing off your ridiculously badass hero as just another goofball. An audience can also suffer from badass fatigue. Sometimes when your CMHB pulls out the badass for the first time, it's played like a big character reveal, shocking the other characters along with the audience. But after that, sometimes writers will abandon the previously demonstrated moron badass dichotomy in favor of keeping the character badass in perpetuity. This character isn't really a CMHB, they're just a badass who had a weird gimmick when they first showed up. Since they lose the comedic moron side to be a perma-badass, we lose the ha that's funny and the aw that's awesome impact. Since the character isn't funny and their badassery isn't surprising, the character loses the benefits gained by being occasional comic relief. When a character is only ever allowed to do one thing, even if that one thing is be a badass, the audience is liable to get bored. Badass fatigue. Know the symptoms. And sometimes the moron and badass sides of the character just don't seem balanced. Frequently, for example, the moron persona is just really annoying or useless and actively gets into unnecessary trouble that it really seems like the badass persona wouldn't allow. This is most commonly an issue with the split personality CMHBs, but can show up with any version if the character's goofiness becomes actively disruptive, at which point, instead of reaping the benefits of a multifaceted character, the audience treats one side of the character as an obstruction to the other. Hard to find the moron half funny if they're just cluttering up the plot for the badass have to clean up later. In its most extreme form, this turns into a whole problem of its own when the moron and badass sides are in direct conflict. See, moron shenanigans are really funny so long as they aren't disruptive. If you have a CMHB who's supposed to be a single coherent character, but something they do in moron mode actively causes problems that it seems like badass mode shouldn't have let happen, that becomes disruptive. If the moron and the badass sides of the character don't fit together, then why put them in the same character in the first place? Consider a CMHB in a dangerous combat situation who goofs around and ends up getting someone injured. In this case, the moronitude actively clashes with the badassery. From a writing angle, the badass side shouldn't have allowed someone to get hurt, so the moronitude starts feeling annoyingly irresponsible and out of character rather than funny. Ideally, you don't want your audience going, ugh, with this again, every time your CMHB starts to goof off. Then again, sometimes the character's moron traits fit perfectly with their badass traits and are still frustrating to the audience. Classic example, Dragon Ball Z's Saiyans are all complete idiots when it comes to fighting, since they care more about fighting strong opponents than they do about actually efficiently stopping them from doing evil stuff. Goku and Vegeta both notoriously let their enemies get as strong as they possibly can in order to get a good fight, and it's just as frustratingly stupid every time. But it's frustratingly stupid and in character, so it's totally fine from a writing angle. Hell, if anything, it makes the character more convincing than the moron. See, sometimes when writing a CMHB, the character can come across as really not that much of a moron at all. They'll mess around when things are chill, but they'll never do anything actively problematic and will handle every crisis that comes their way with customary levels of competent badassery. Basically, they're funny, but they're not stupid. And this is fine. But you can also get comedy from characters who really do stupid stuff despite being badass. Their moronitude isn't just decorative, it's true to their character and can actually cause problems. Brooklyn Nine-Nine's classic man-child CMHB Jake Peralta is comically terrible at being an adult or following the rules, but he's an amazing detective. But his loose cannoning and disdain for protocol have actually gotten him in trouble beyond just pissing off authority figures when his actions have unforeseen consequences. While these storylines can be annoying to the audience if the stupidity involved seems out of character, Jake is established at being terrible at thinking through consequences, so it totally fits for him to actually screw up on occasion. And it makes it more interesting than if his wacky stupidity was just restricted to office pranks and cute one-liners. He's a flawed character, and that makes him more interesting than if he were a totally unproblematic golden boy. Broadly, the biggest strength of the CMHB is that it avoids the primary pitfalls faced by comic relief characters and stone-cold badasses. Comic relief can get insufferable with overexposure, or just feel situationally inappropriate when the going gets rough, or worst of all, wind up obnoxiously useless in high-stakes situations, cluttering up the drama with half-assed one-liners and getting in the way of more serious characters. On the other side, stone-cold badasses can often wind up stuck as non-entities outside of dangerous or dramatic situations. If they're not kicking ass, the writer doesn't know what to do with them. By writing a CMHB, or at least writing one well, you end up with a character who has a charming and funny personality outside of danger and is more than capable of pulling their weight while in danger. A CMHB also has the potential to have a lot of emotional impact on your audience. Now, a pure comic relief character can usually only make the audience laugh, or if they wind up in a situation so bad that they can't or won't be funny, they can sometimes give the audience an "oh no" reaction, since their uncharacteristic humorlessness communicates that this situation is really bad and or sad as it's managed to knock the fun out of character made of fun. A pure badass character Luther can also produce the oh no response in dangerous enough situations, but they're mostly designed to get the oh yeah reaction when they do something exceptionally cool. The CMHP can readily produce all three reactions. When they're funny, they get a laugh. When they're cool, they get an oh yeah. And when they're truly deeply upset, they can readily get an oh no. My favorite example of this is Justice League Unlimited's Flash, who, in the climax of his most memorable arc, manages to produce all three reactions in rapid succession. Throughout the show, the Flash has shown himself to be a classic, lovable goofball and the designated funny man in a team full of generally stoic badasses. And he's a solidly written man-child variant CMHP in that his humor never compromises his ability to save the day. He's also very clearly the emotional heart of the team, which is touched on in some detail in an early episode of the show where the team finds an alternate universe where the Flash had been killed several years prior by President Lex Luthor, and the League had gone full dictator as a result, starting with Superman killing Luthor in the Oval Office before going on to take over the world. At the time, Flash even quips about how this proves he's the heart and conscience of the team and they should probably put all their focus on keeping him alive. It's a joke, but it's also kind of not a joke. This comes back into focus in Season 4, when Lex Luthor decides to start screwing with Superman by hinting that he's trying to recreate the circumstances in that other universe that drove Superman to abandon his morals and full-on kill him. Step 1 is become president, Step 2 is kill the Flash, Step 3 is get murdered. Stellar plan, Lex. Flash even cracks a couple jokes about it and tells the team that clearly the number one way to foil Lex's evil plan is to make sure to keep him alive at all costs. Obviously, superhero nonsense happens to complicate things, and in the finale, Luthor ends up fusing with Brainiac into a big scary robot man with Brainiac's ludicrous power and Luthor's flair for the dramatic. During the boss fight, we get a few funny Flash moments because that's just kind of how he talks most of the time. But after KOing the League in a big explosion, Luthor decides he may as well kill the Flash while he's got him in despair, and Flash, for the first time in the show, seems scared. This is an oh no moment for the audience and signals that this bombastic superhero season finale has taken a turn for the intense. Flash has been in danger before, obviously, it is a superhero show, but he's never been this alone and frightened before. Since he's normally such a ray of sunshine, or at least snarky when in distress, seeing his character completely devoid of wackiness is an audience gut punch. Zero attempts at comedy means he's really freaked out. The oh-no intensifies when Flash manages to break out of Luthor's grip, but when Lex condescendingly asks him if he's really going to fight him alone, Flash hesitates, then wordlessly turns and runs away. No sass, no one-liner, just running for his life. But this oh-no moment quickly turns into an oh yeah when Flash reappears on the horizon and blindsides Luthor really hard, having run around the world first to build up speed. He then does this like 6 more times, culminating in him vibrating Luthor and Brainiac apart molecule by molecule while moving faster than we've ever seen him go before. This is probably the coolest thing he ever does in the show, in no small part because he's so completely unfunny during the scene. This is pure badass, no funny, and it's awesome. But it immediately snaps back to, oh no, when Flash vanishes into the Speed Force from overtaxing his superpowers. And obviously they pull him out and it ends happily and stuff because it is a kid's show, but this is the emotional impact a CMHP can have. You're used to the character being funny and awesome in roughly equal measure. When they're serious and awesome, you revel in the pure badassery of them going all out. But when they're serious and totally not funny, it hits you like a truck that this adaptable ray of sunshine is really freaked out and has no idea what to do. Now obviously, this example only worked as well as it did because Flash was a really well-written CMHP, who never got annoying and was consistently written as pretty much always being at least a little wacky. He'd never really gone humorless badass before, so it had a lot of impact when he finally stopped messing around. He also didn't bounce back immediately. When they pull him out of the Speed Force, he just kind of weakly says he's pretty sure he could never go that fast again, and it really sells that this was a very disturbing experience that's left him quite shaken. So CMHPs are capable of hitting the audience with a lot of emotional highs and lows, as well as navigating a range of situations without feeling unnecessary. Where a pure comic relief character can be useless at best in a serious situation, a CMHP can be relied on to stay relevant even when the plot starts getting hairy. And where a stone-cold badass can be awkwardly out of place when the plot gets all lighthearted and fillery, the CMHP is charming even when out of danger. If you can manage to hit that sweet spot between irritatingly stupid and not really all that funny, you'll find a lot of possibilities to play around with. But there's more you can do with the character than just slide around a dial between all moron and all badass. See, a lot of the core concept of the CMHP is built around this perceived dichotomy between funny and badass. The idea that you have funny scenes and awesome scenes, but never the twain shall meet. And this isn't really the craziest idea in the world. A lot of our comedy is built on people screwing up, while a lot of our awesome moments are written around people succeeding spectacularly. And it's hard to make those concepts play nice. The CMHP is an attempt to play with this. It produces a character capable of wacky failures and heroic successes, and keeps both sides of the character fresh by never letting either one overstay their welcome. The character fails in a funny way and succeeds in an awesome way, but these qualities are still kept separate in some key ways. The CMHP might quip to punctuate a fight, but the actual fighting part will usually be kept serious. Even the man-child CMHP variant, who's badass in a funny way, can still come across as maybe less effective a badass than they could be if they got really serious. Lots of quippy superheroes signal that they've gotten really serious by finally shutting up. The comedy intrinsic to the character is still seen as a detriment or an obstruction to the badassery. But guys, did you know that you can have scenes that are awesome and funny at the same time? Let's talk about Jackie Chan. Buster Keaton was a pioneer in slapstick comedy. Bruce Lee was a pioneer in martial arts cinema. Jackie Chan is what happens when a Bruce Lee grade martial artist starts idolizing Buster Keaton and playing around with weapons grade slapstick. What resulted was a whole bunch of movies where Jackie Chan leveraged his excellent martial arts ability to choreograph some very striking fight scenes that were really, really funny. There's a kind of physical comedy you can only really get when you're ridiculously physically skilled and you're willing to do 100 takes to get the exact impact right. The payoff is a library of highly engaging fight scenes that are, yes, simultaneously funny and awesome. And that makes the character involved simultaneously funny and awesome. Comedy is not inherently built on failure, it's built on the unexpected, and it's very possible to make a character badass in consistently unexpected ways. The CMHP can, in its most extreme form, embody this perfect fusion of badassery and comedy, where their characterization is almost completely static instead of switching between comedy or badassery as the situation requires. So, broadly, the primary benefit of this character archetype is the hybridization of the most impactful qualities of its two component archetypes, but the hardest part in writing this character is striking the balance between the two without one overshadowing or disrupting the other. In its most sophisticated form, the two archetypes fully combine into one thoroughly coherent character, but that's even harder to get right than the normal version of the character, and I can only think of one example that ever made that work consistently. So, yeah. Here's a trick question. Why do people talk about strong female characters and not strong male characters? Isn't that a double standard? Well, here's why it's a trick question. We do talk about strong male characters, but we call them things like heroes or badasses or mentors. We don't need to specify that they're male because people just assume. There's this thing I've noticed in modern Western writing where any trait that isn't white or male or straight is kind of considered to be a modifier on a character. Those three traits are considered kind of a default baseline. Now, this is also why people will often say stuff like, why did you have to make this character gay, or not white, or female? It's not strictly necessary for the plot, so why would you do it? But most of those same people don't bother to ask why you would make a character a white straight male. Although that is changing a little bit nowadays, but basically, in America at least, that's often considered the default state of being in fiction, even though there's no such thing as a default state of being in real life. Now, basically, every culture and time period has
We're gonna find out. What's that? You going out? You going out? Let's make a show, man. It'll be a minute before I come back down here, so. Oh. It's my puppy right there. So I think he a dog. My daughter's cat. Everything he think he a dog. My kids at my mom's house. Fucking great. Chill, you know what I'm saying? I ain't gotta worry about yelling at no motherfucking body. I ain't gotta worry about cleaning up after nobody for a little minute. I mean, I gotta go get them in the morning, but she gonna keep them tomorrow night too. So. 2 nights that I get there. Fucking relax. Fuck, love it. I love it. I'm the babies, but shit, they has been on my damn nerves. Death. Sometimes you just gotta be on the dolo side, you know what I'm saying? Sometimes fuck this and send their ass to the motherfucking granny. That's what you gotta do. We shouldn't have nothing to do tonight, so that's what I did. Dripping. Don't slip on the drip, you know. Popping like, you know what I'm saying? That shit. Popping like, you know what I'm saying? Championships, you know what I'm saying? Let it poppin' on it. Real nigga shit. I don't know, I ain't really expect much out of this anyway, cause it's Friday, motherfuckers is out doing that 1-2. I'm probably about to just get off this motherfucker real quick and go get into some mischief of my own, it is. Never forget that. That's where it start right there. Dreams. Make them come true. You know what I'm saying? This is the boy Dripp. And see y'all another night. For the drivers and the shooters.